French Revolution. In the 18th century, France stood on the edge of a storm that would forever reshape not only its destiny but also the political landscape of Europe. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, did not come from a single spark. Rather, it was the result of decades of tension, inequality, and discontent woven into the fabric of French society. At the heart of this upheaval were the economic crises, rigid social structures, political mismanagement, and the spread of new ideas that together created a perfect storm of revolution. Understanding the causes requires stepping into the world of 18th century France, where grandeur and suffering existed side by side. The old and social inequality. At the core of pre-revolutionary France was the Ancien Régime, the centuries-old social and political system. Society was divided into three estates: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, the common people. On paper, this division seemed organized, but in reality, it created unbearable inequalities. The estate, composed of clergy, enjoyed immense privileges. They controlled vast amounts of land, collected tithes from peasants, and were exempt from many taxes. The church not only held spiritual authority but also acted as a political and economic power. The second estate, the nobility, also enjoyed privilege. Nobles owned about a quarter of the land in France, had exclusive rights to high offices in the army and government, and were exempt from the most burdensome taxes. For them, luxury and privilege were a birthright. The estate, however, was the majority, nearly 98% of the French population. It included peasants, urban workers, and the rising middle class, or bourgeoisie. While the peasants toiled under feudal dues and heavy taxation, the bourgeoisie found themselves locked out of political power despite their growing wealth and education. This rigid inequality fostered resentment that simmered beneath the surface for decades. The third estate carried the weight of the nation, yet it remained voiceless in the halls of power. Economic crisis and burden of taxation. The economic situation in France before 1789 was dire. The country had spent enormous sums on wars, most notably the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783. While French support for the American Revolution was celebrated as a victory against Britain, it came at a crushing cost. France accumulated staggering debt, and the crown struggled to pay its expenses. To raise revenue, the monarchy turned to taxation. But here lay the problem: the burden fell almost entirely on the third estate. Nobles and clergy enjoyed exemptions, while peasants and workers endured crushing taxes, feudal dues, and even corvée, forced labor. The situation became unbearable as food prices soared. By the 1780s, poor harvests led to bread shortages, and hunger stalked the countryside. For ordinary families, bread was the staple of life, and when they could no longer afford it, anger turned into desperation. The match between rising economic hardship and the continued display of aristocratic luxury created a stark contrast. While peasants starved, the nobility hosted lavish banquets, and Queen Marie Antoinette became infamous for her extravagant lifestyle. To the people, she symbolized indifference to their suffering, whether or not the infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," was ever truly spoken. This economic injustice added fuel to the growing fire of resentment. Weakness of the monarchy. The monarchy itself was a central cause of the revolution. King Louis XVI inherited a kingdom plagued by debt, inequality, and unrest, yet he lacked the decisiveness and vision to enact meaningful reform. Attempts to tax the nobility were met with resistance, and Louis often vacillated between reform and retreat. He called together finance ministers like Turgot, Necker, and Calonne, but their efforts failed when confronted with the entrenched privileges of the aristocracy. In 1787, he convened the Assembly of Notables to gain approval for new taxes. But instead of supporting the king, the nobles rejected his proposals. In 1789, desperate for a solution, Louis summoned the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not been called since 1614. By doing so, he opened a door that would never close again. What was meant as a solution to the financial crisis became a platform for the Third Estate to voice its grievances, and ultimately, to demand an end to the Ancien Régime. intellectual climate. While social and economic tensions laid the groundwork, the Enlightenment provided the ideological spark. Throughout the 18th century, philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu challenged the traditional order. They spoke of liberty, equality, reason, and the rights of man. Their works spread widely, especially among the educated bourgeoisie. Montesquieu's writings on the separation of powers inspired visions of a more balanced government. Voltaire's criticism of the church eroded the moral authority of the clergy. Rousseau's social contract argued for the sovereignty of the people and the notion that government must serve the will of its citizens. These ideas ignited imaginations and provided a language through which discontent could be expressed. The success of the American Revolution added to the excitement. If colonists across the Atlantic could overthrow monarchy and establish a republic, why not the French? Veterans and thinkers brought back not only tales of freedom but also the conviction that such change was possible in France. The Enlightenment transformed resentment into vision, giving the Third Estate a cause to rally behind. Tensions and symbolism. Philosophy, culture played its part. The French monarchy had long been a symbol of grandeur. The Palace of Versailles, with its glittering halls and endless gardens, represented the wealth and excess of the royal family. To the struggling masses, Versailles was both a wonder and an insult, a glittering monument built on their misery. Antoinette in particular became a target. As a foreign queen from Austria, she was resented and distrusted. Stories of her extravagance circulated widely, some true and some exaggerated, but all damaging. In a society where symbolism mattered deeply, the image of a queen who indulged while her people starved became unbearable. And the Estates General. States General finally convened in May 1789. The divisions of French society were laid bare. Each estate traditionally had one vote, meaning that the clergy and nobility, though only 2% of the population, could outvote the Third Estate. But the Third Estate had come determined not to be silenced. Representing the vast majority of the nation, its members demanded reforms and equal representation. When their calls were ignored, they took a radical step. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the people. Days later, they gathered in the famous tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had drafted a new constitution. This moment marked the political birth of the revolution, but it was fueled by decades of social, economic, and ideological causes. Of peasants and urban workers. While intellectuals and bourgeois leaders debated politics, ordinary people carried their own burdens. For peasants, centuries of feudal obligations weighed heavily. They not only paid taxes to the state but also dues to landlords and tithes to the church. Many lived on the edge of survival, and poor harvests in 1788 pushed them into desperation. In cities, workers faced rising bread prices and stagnant wages. Paris, in particular, became a hotbed of unrest. Rumors of grain hoarding and conspiracy spread rapidly. Hungry crowds filled the streets, ready to act when opportunity struck. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was not simply a political act but a popular uprising born of hunger, anger, and hope. A perfect storm. In the 1780s, France was a nation of contradictions. It was wealthy and powerful yet drowning in debt. It was home to philosophers of liberty yet ruled by an absolute monarch. It had a rising mass eager for change but an entrenched aristocracy clinging to privilege. It had starving peasants and restless urban workers watching nobility feast. The social inequalities of the Ancien regime, the financial crisis, the failures of the monarchy, the rise of Enlightenment thought, and the desperation of ordinary people was a strand of the rope pulling France toward revolution. Alone, any one of them might have led to unrest. Together, they created a movement so powerful it would shake the world. Conclusion. The French Revolution did not erupt suddenly. It was the culmination of centuries of injustice, decades of mismanagement, and years of suffering. The rigid inequality of the three estates created resentment. The economic crisis brought hunger and despair. The monarchy's weakness failed to address problems, while Enlightenment thinkers provided new visions of freedom. Cultural tensions and symbols of extravagance further alienated the people, and the convening of the Estates General gave discontent a stage. By 1789, France was a powder keg, and when the spark came, it exploded into one of the most transformative revolutions in history. The causes of the French Revolution remind us that when inequality, hardship, and failed leadership converge, even the most established order can collapse. From the streets of Paris to the halls of Versailles, the revolution was born from the voices of a people who had endured too much for too long.